That was my last sip of Gatorade. Now I'm on my own. So shall we?
Yeah.
Okay, so last stream, uh, we were going over the lore of the Writsmith. I think we got into it a bit. It might have been last stream or the stream before.
It's been a few streams we've gone into the Writsmith.
Yeah. But whenever we go over the lore of him, we're kind of leaving out the design side. The goals we had, what we were trying to communicate. And since we'd like to do a retrospective on each of the classes, and the Writsmith is the next chronologically, and is sort of a chronologically based class. I figured it's probably the right time to do him. Uh, and so, um, in the interest of not prolonging this any further, I guess we'll just run right into it. Um, I've spoken about length about the identity of the Writsmith, but for those of you watching just within this video, and actually, I don't know if we will be able to, Logan. So actually, let's not go into this right immediately. But I was thinking last night it would be cool to have an annotation showing the highlight or the video where we go into depth about the narrative around right there.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. That way they don't have to go search out the other video and they can just click on it if they want to, if they know more. Or we can do both things and put it in the description in case they want to watch through the whole video first and then they're still curious.
Right. Put a link in the annotation, put a link in the description.
Right. Exactly. Um, so I think that's something that we could probably do, or we should probably do. Uh, but after that aside, let's get restructured, and we can start, I guess, the Writsmith thing from here. So the Writsmith is an intellectual of sorts. He is at this university, and it's kind of like an abbey as well for scientific thought. And he's sent out sort of like as his final project to record uh, a tome about his travels and whatever field interests him most, and then return with whatever information he adds and add it to the store of books and scrolls and all sorts of other kind of information that they have within this massive library, this compendium of all the human knowledge. And I'm sure they have more than one compendium, but this one is the big one, the main one. And so he's going off on his adventures, and he's a mage. He's the magey class. He's supposed to feel like he's not just dealing damage, like he's not just interacting like all of the melee classes do. And so far, the retrospectives have been about melee classes, so you've only seen, I guess, that side of the design, the more direct interaction with enemies. With this guy, we want sort of a layer of abstraction between yourself and your opponents, so that they can't quite know exactly what you're going to be doing on each turn, or really guess as to what your actions will be on each turn, and they have to play around um, things that you're setting up on the field rather than the damage that you set up on the field. I know I said damage a number of times, but really the distinction has to be clear. If melees are really good at doing damage, or really good about preventing damage, like a tank would be, then the mages have to operate outside of that spectrum. They have to be looking at what status ailments they can inflict on people. They have to be looking at how they can make targets less preferable without blocking the damage going into them. Um, and so to do that, we created a stack effect that you'll see on the rank 1, which is parable. And as with the last retrospective on the Law Strider, I'm going to kind of be referring to the ability without going through directly what it does, um, so that I don't bore you guys watching, because I'm sure you can read through if you'd like. But if you have any questions, if you guys ever have any questions, just ask them in the Twitch chat. And if you want to, if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment and ask, because we would love to go through. And right now, it's no trouble for us at all to read every comment that's posted. So, um, to create this level of interaction, this degree of interaction, we took um, a mechanic that we really liked from the game Magic the Gathering and altered it to fit our purposes. And the mechanic that we borrowed is, even the stacks are called echo stacks, is not the echo mechanic from Magic. Instead, what we were looking at was the suspend mechanic. And for those of you familiar with Magic the Gathering, you'll know what suspend does. But for those unfamiliar, suspend is a mechanic which can reward you for playing cards and having them come out later than when you play them. In other words, they don't come out immediately. They come in with suspend counters attached to them. And each turn at the beginning of your upkeep, a suspend counter comes off of whichever card you played. And when there are no more on it at your upkeep, it casts the spell or the creature or the land, whatever was suspended. And it's a very interesting tension that it creates on the board because your opponent is always kind of looking at that thing that's not quite in play yet. You're trying to keep it in the back of their head. Oh, okay, what's going to happen when this goes off? Another really cool thing that Magic does is some of the cards that have suspend will activate an effect whenever a suspend counter is taken off of them. And there are ways that you can pay more on their cost to get more counters on those cards. And so it's this very rich, complex mechanic that they hadn't really gone back to or haven't really gone back to in a long time. I think it's been about a decade or so since the last time they really used suspend. Though I could be off on my timeline there. Anyway, we thought it'd be cool if this time mage, because that's what the Writsmith ends up being, um, had an effect like that. That mechanically showed the players what you were manipulating, how you were manipulating it, and to could chunk out a representation of time passing or time being added or time being repositioned. And so that's what echo stacks are trying to do. As for what they actually do at this point on rank 1, uh, it's not immediately clear. The echo stacks don't really do anything in and of themselves at this point. They're just a way in which you can resolve your spell effects a little bit after you cast the ability. Um, I will say that one key difference that we have between the way we've chosen to do Echo versus how Magic chose to do Suspend uh, is that you can resolve your Echo stacks at 0 or at 12. Whereas in Magic, when something is suspended and it hits 0, that's when it resolves. So if you're a Writsmith, there's a lot of incentive for you to keep building echo stacks on top of one another until there's this big release where every single spell that's been resolved on someone with echo stacks goes off at once. Um, and either way, everything that you cast on someone will go off at once when the echo stacks resolve. So if I've been casting my rank 1 parable on an enemy or an ally, and I've casted on them 4 times, and that's built it up to 12 echo stacks, then bam, all 4 of them cast at once, and that can be a huge effect, especially when Parable can both heal and deal damage. And I said earlier that we really don't want to play around with dealing damage, and I'm sort of unhappy with the implementation here in that we're looking at something that does deal damage as a function um, of the ability, but really we were looking for something that with the rank 1 could find its opposition very clearly. Like it's doing one thing to allies and it's doing a mirrored thing to enemies. And perhaps the easiest thing in games, especially in RPGs, to look at as a sort of mirrored effect is damage versus healing. It's just the simplest way that you're interacting with enemies. To kill them, you're dealing damage. to unkill them, you're healing them back up. Or unkill your allies, you're healing them back up. And your health bar is precious to you. So that, and with the idea of time in general taking a toll on people's health, or age taking a toll on people's health, was kind of what we wanted to get across with the idea of this parable ability. But I think I've spent too long on it, so let's go to rank 2. With rank 2, we're giving the player a reason to put echo stacks on people besides just for the rank 1 effect. In other words, this gives you a reason to put echo stacks on one person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, as many people as you can proliferate them out to. And as a rank 2, you don't really have the ability to proliferate them out that far. Each rank 1 is unique in that you can use it as an active and a basic, so you can put echo stacks on people at 2 points during a combat cycle. So 2 people per turn, more or less, or per combat cycle. Which means that by the end of your second combat cycle, you could have 4 people with echo stacks on them. But the passive that we introduced is one that puts some mana constraints on your opponents, and gives your allies a little bit more leeway on casting abilities that they might want to use. It also rewards you for getting all the way up to 12 echo stacks by returning your mana. So it's meant to make these echo stacks more interesting in and of themselves, rather than just as a mechanic that we're introducing to make the spells more interesting. And I think that's important. I think that's one of the things that Magic the Gathering teaches pretty well with Suspend. The cool Suspend cards are the ones that do something every time a Suspend counter comes off. All that we're doing here is we're equating the idea of we're taking that idea of them coming off, and we're just applying it to Suspend in general, as long as, or Echo in our game, as long as someone has an Echo counter on them, the effect is taking place. And I guess there is that resolution bit with the 12 echo stacks, with building them up and up and up. But it's a little bit difficult at this point to see why that would become so interesting, or why a player would want to proliferate things out. So immediately with the rank 3, the next ability, Ravel, we sort of borrow another Magic the Gathering mechanic with Storm. And as before, with those of you who are familiar with Magic, Storm is a fairly broken mechanic. Basically, for every spell that's cast in a turn, I think. No, it's not in a turn. It's basically the way Storm works is, let's say I cast a Fireball, and then someone counterspells it, and then I counterspell their spell, and then they counter mine back, and we get into this big counter war with all of our spells going on the stack. If I play a Storm card after that, for each spell that was played, that Storm effect gets multiplied out by 1 times. I don't know if that's the correct way of saying that, but let's say I was going to do 1 damage with a card that has Storm, and it had 7 spell effects played before it. If I play that card, now it's going to deal 8 damage, which is pretty interesting. It's a really cool sort of way of or however many effects it was. Maybe it'd be 7 damage. I'm not. It's been a long time since I looked at Storm cards when we were designing the Writsmith at the very beginning. But what we thought would be interesting was taking this idea of suspending things, or echoing them in our game, and then allowing you to control how you stormed off, to basically pre-plan when all of your abilities were going to go off and how many of them were going to go off to gain some large advantage. And so what Ravel is doing is it's letting you put echo stacks everywhere, as long as a whole bunch of abilities were casted at once. And And that's pretty good. I mean, it lets you tax opponents. It lets you give back to your allies, but it's not. It doesn't have to be just that. You don't have to spread them out all over the place. You could also choose to stack a whole bunch of echo on one person and have your 12 stacks resolve and go crazy with all the effects that were suspended off on them. And as of right now, that's just damage or healing. But as you go further into the kit, it can become much more debilitating to have a whole bunch of those effects resolving off at once. Um, it's got a lot of utility, which is why we wanted to include something like it. And within the first three abilities, as with most classes, what we've tried to do is introduce a primary mechanic that's interesting, which are the echo stacks, a secondary mechanic, which is interesting, or a tertiary mechanic, which is interesting, that works with the primary mechanic. And here we have this storm thing, which isn't named. It's just signaled by the syntax for each ability cast behind this ability on the stack. Um, and at this point, the player of the Writsmith is going to have a pretty good idea of what their class does. They may not be able to manage their echo stacks super well at this point, but they'll be proliferating out a whole lot of them. And if you were if you have looked at the Writsmith background story video, or if you were here the other day during stream, you heard about how those echo stacks are also um, supposed to symbolize the lies that the Writsmith is building up around him, um, that he's basing his identity upon at this point, or beginning to base his identity upon as he learns more and more that he's in control of time to a certain degree. At this point in the story, once you get to level 3, I don't think that'll be so much the case, and that's something that we had to keep in mind as well. Was how much control do we give you over echo stacks this early? Because if we give you too much, then it feels like the Writsmith knows that he can control time at this point. Whereas if we give you too few, then it feels like there's no cohesion whatsoever in what you're trying to do. You're not having enough impact on the opponents or on your allies. So, um, not a tremendously difficult balance to strike, but definitely something we were thinking about. Something else that we should probably add to the beginning of these videos is a spoiler warning for potential narrative spoilers, potential ability spoilers, that sort of thing. Because I'm sure there are some players out there who don't want to know all of this. They'd like to go in blind, and I'd like to respect their wishes. Um, but aside from that brief note, we can move on to rank 4, which is Seijura, unless, of course, Logan has anything to add in the first 3 abilities.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So Seijura is inactive, and I haven't been commenting on basic inactive so far. Um, and at some point, we'll do a video that explains all of the mechanics within the game, because those things have been discussed briefly on stream, and some of our more regular viewers understand the mechanics from hearing those explanations. But I think it's probably safe to go in and explain them all at once, although I think that'll be like a 2-hour video. But anyway, it's an active, which means that you're having to choose between using this and Ravel on any given combat cycle. It allows you to target an enemy or an ally's ability and set it back a turn, more or less. Well, in its most basic form, if they have no echo stacks on them, it gives them an echo stack and it makes their ability take until the next turn to resolve. But let's say hypothetically that I have an enemy which I have 10 echo stacks on, or something like that. If I use this ability on them, then ordinarily it would take 11 turns for their effect to resolve. And as soon as we realized that part of it, that you could use it in that way, we were like, oh, that's really strong. And technically, I could just wait for their echo stack to tick down each turn and then just add this ability on again, and none of their effects would ever go off. I could soft lock an enemy's basic or active ability each turn. which doesn't feel like very much fun for them. So instead of doing that, what we decided to do was add that last sentence on to the ability, um, which says that until that enemy or ally no longer possesses echo stacks, the rate at which their echo stacks deplete is doubled. So if I use this on them once, they're at 10 echo stacks or something like that, then each turn they'll be losing 2. But if I use it on them again to soft lock another one of their abilities at the beginning of each of their turns, they'll lose 4 echo stacks. And so, since the max you can have on someone is 12, there's very little way after you do that to someone that you can keep blocking their abilities down. And we wanted for that balance to work that way, for it to be very hard to continuously lock someone. And if you're doing it the other way around, where you're just locking them turn over turn by giving them Echo 1, they never actually have Echo stacks on them for very long, because it's never happening that during their turn they get Echo stacks. Echo stacks resolve at the beginning of the player who's affected by them's turn, um, which I didn't say earlier, but I think is important to note as well. So Gyre is a rank 5 passive, and it lets you manipulate your stacks a little bit easier with attacks or active abilities. You can tick them up or tick them down, and we're giving the players this tool of control, because let's say you have let's say you want to go off with rank 3 with Ravel. At this point in time, you can really only go off from spells that you've put on one person. But let's say hypothetically that I cast an active with Gyre. I could reduce one person who's down to 1 echo stack or something like that, down to 0 echo stacks during that other person's turn when all of their echo stacks are resolving, and then cast Ravel behind all of the other effects. Now, or I guess in our game it works that you put it in front of all of the other effects on the stack, but that's kind of inconsequential. And then you could have effects you've been piling up over multiple turns on 2 people go off, and if you're really good technically, um, you could later on in the kit have multiple people's echo stacks going off at the beginning of someone else's turn, and really kind of get out of control with how much you're able to storm out echo stacks. Well, at this point in the kit, storm out echo stacks, but at rank 7 you get to do something cooler. So let's get through rank 6 then. Rank 6 is a basic, which means that on each of my turns I'm trying to figure out if I want to use this parable, take a basic attack, or move for the turn. And what Simile does is it makes it so that you can take 2 targets and have their echo stacks tick down at the same time. And if they're on the same row, you can have them gain echo stacks instead of losing them at the beginning of each turn. But basically what this allows you to do at its most basic level, and there are a number of things that you can use this for, is to do what I was talking about with rank 5, where you have multiple things resolving at once. Now you can have up to 3 or 4 people resolving at once by linking multiple people together and having their echo stacks tick down at the beginning of someone's turn. As you can see, this is starting to get fairly complex, so the job of the Writsmith is becoming more complicated. Their management of echo stacks is becoming more complicated. The lies are building on top of one another, basically, if we were to look at it within a symbolic context. But there's another thing that it's doing that is sort of interesting, I think. The way that the linked targets gain echo stacks instead of losing them is by being on the same row. So let's say that I have it set up really well so that I'm going to have multiple echo stacks go off at once. An opponent could take their turn to move to another row to combat what I was doing, more or less, to kind of counter my setup of having them gain echo stacks and go off at 12 together. Or I could have multiple allies on the same row just gain echo stacks and go up to 12 and fire off all at once and gain back a ton of my mana. Another thing that you could do if you were really thinking about it, is use the interaction with Seijura to have multiple people's echo stacks depleting at a doubled rate whenever that person's turn comes around. So there are a lot of ways that you can manipulate echo stacks now to go off at the same time, but also ways that you can manipulate the rate of depletion when they're depleting, uh, how they're depleting, which I think will make the Writsmith an interesting means of approaching combat. You won't really be interacting with anyone in a sort of damagey context, um, but you'll certainly be interacting with a lot of stacks that are attached to those people. You're almost playing a resource management sub game instead of thinking about the people who are on the map, um, which isn't afforded for by either the Lost Strider or the Cavalier. Um, and we'll get to the Caporetto, I think, probably a little bit later today. But let's look at the rank 7 ability, Ink Fetter, which is our second Storm ability. And I know that I'm probably falling under some sort of trademark or copyright issue by using these Magic the Gathering keywords, but I think they help in our understanding. Um, Mainly, I'm doing this to try and go through and inform you guys about why we chose to do what with our design. So Inkfetter makes it so that for each ability that goes off behind this ability on the stack, so for each thing after it on the stack that's multiplying its storm count, you get to summon a past self to your row. So you're summoning all of these possibilities of what could have been um, in their corporeal forms. And they're not summons either. They're not really counted as summons. They're sort of counted as you, and you could have a bajillion of them out at once, like a lot of them, depending on how you storm off. It would take some doing, but you could have quite a few. And each of these clones has more health if you summon more in at once. Um, so you can use them to hold the front row, for instance, as characters, which I think would be, pretty cool. That's something that can be rough if your melees are really low HP, if your tank line's really low HP, and they're trying to hold the front line. Now you have these past selves that can't really take a hit, but if you have enough of them, then it could take the opposing team multiple turns to clear it if they don't have some AoE damage. Um, but the cool thing about these past selves, they don't really do very much on their own, but you can consume them as a free active, so without taking your active use for the turn, um, to put Echo 1 on an enemy. Um, and when that Echo 1 resolves, Paradox deals direct damage equal to the number of Echo stacks on that person's row to that enemy. Uh, So you could put a ton of these on someone and bump them up to 10, and then if they have a ton of echo stacks on their row, conceivably, you could kill someone with this. I think the balancing factor, and it does sound pretty strong from how we're talking about it now, is that if you choose to storm off with this, you're not storming off with Rabble. You don't have a ton of echo stacks that are already on people. You've probably used most of your spell effects to get these past selves out. And since the enemy team can interact with them, they can kill these spell vessels that you've set up before you get to go off with them. So while it is very powerful, or has the ability to be very powerful, um, it also requires you to be very ahead on board to get the most out of it. And for card game players, that's something called win more. And we're not trying to make really a win more mechanic, but we are making something that rewards you for being ahead, uh, and something that punishes you for playing it at the incorrect time. Because Ravel is always going to be the more conservative choice, the safer choice, whereas Inkfetter is a thing that's constantly pulling you and saying, "I'm the cool one, use me." Um, Especially when you first get it at rank 7. But rank 8 is an ability which I haven't looked at in a long time, so let me read it briefly. um, sure, okay, so the way this works is at the beginning of each battle, the first ally that you hit with an Echo Stack, that you put an Echo Stack on, becomes the target of the passive. So it's kind of more of like an ability passive than most passive are. But once per combat cycle, you can copy the ability of that ally, whether it's an active or a basic, and you cast it with Echo too. So um, it really increases your options, I guess. It increases what you can do, and it gives you a source of more echo on a turn, which would give you the ability to storm off a little bit better. Um, it's it's unclear how much how powerful that's going to be. It's something we're gonna have to keep an eye on and check for balance with. Maybe we'll have to make it so that you can only cast an active that ally controls, and it is kind of balanced because you have to pick which ally you think is going to benefit you most when you first put your echo stacks out. But in another way, it sort of punishes you for putting echo stacks on a better target for echo stacks, but a worse target for a figment. Um, and you know that's probably a fair criticism. Um, Ellipsis is the rank 9 passive, and it makes it so that the first ability that you cast each combat cycle gains priority 1 on the stack. And the stack is something I don't want to go into too much here. We've talked about it at other times, but it's a term that we're borrowing from Magic the Gathering. Um, and I'm not sure if they were the first game to ever use that concept, but I know that a lot of games have something similar now. It's basically the order in which effects are resolving if multiple effects are going off at once. And our stack works differently than theirs, but priority 1 means that your ability is going to resolve first, always. It's gonna happen first. And so for those storm abilities that we've created, that's very, very important. But if you're storming with your first ability each turn, which is when you have to use Ellipsis with your first ability, then you miss out on the chance of getting more stacks out there. And so it's pretty balanced, I think, um, or it has a chance to be balanced that you gain priority 1 on the stack. The other part of the effect is that and this is complex. It would take a diagram to explain the second part, I think. Or at least I've had to use a diagram when I was talking with other people who are doing the design. But, and maybe that's worthwhile. So let's do that. Stack speed diagram. Let's save. Okay, so here's our stack speed diagram. And I apologize for Microsoft Paint. It is the it is the depressing first choice when you're trying to do something quickly outside of Photoshop. But if we think about all of these people, red is the first person to use their spell, and purple is the last person to use their, being in a turn order, which is on the left, um, and or on the right if you want to look there. And it goes red, yellow, blue, orange, green, purple in terms of order. After red casts its ability, or his ability, her ability, yellow gets a chance to cast theirs, and yellow gets a chance to cast their ability 1 second afterward and has 5 seconds to cast it. Blue gets a chance to cast their ability 2 seconds afterward and gets 5 seconds to cast it, all the way to orange, which starts at 3, 4, 5. And that means that purple, the last person in the turn order, as of right now, will get the most time to think about which ability they want to cast, even though they're casting their ability last. Um, and where that matters, why that's important, uh, is because our stack works based off of the speed of the character. So characters who have higher speed are going first in the turn order, and their spell effects are resolving first. There has to be some balancing factor for people going last. And our decision was to make it so that slow characters had more time to think, more time to see what was going on. With rank 9, what we're allowing you to do is after you cast your spell effect, you can wait all the way until that person's last second to change which ability you're using from the list of abilities that you have. Now, obviously, it has to be an ability that would make sense at that moment. You couldn't cast a basic at active speed, for instance. but you could change which active you were using or which basic you were using at a point in time when you cast something that's got priority one on the stack. So so let's go on to actually did I do an okay enough job of explaining that?
The turn order
Yeah.
and how spells go through a stack on
Right.
the active phase.
Right.
Definitely.
Okay. Cool. I didn't want to leave out too much.
uh, Pretty
Go.
clear.
Okay. So we're at rank 10 now. The final ability it is called Axiom, and this is the point in the Writsmith's narrative where they should have a complete understanding of how they're manipulating time, um, how their lies are affecting time, basically, and to sort of to get that across to the player. And this was actually Logan's idea. This was one of the first ideas that I heard from him when we were first starting to talk about design. We approached him about maybe working with this. He said it'd be really cool if a time mage had the ability to completely blank out a phase, a combat cycle. I was like, oh, that's really cool. And it works really well with effects like Echo that are based on effects like Suspend, because while everyone can't take their turn, the effects that are happening each turn are still happening. Um, so you can use this ability to make it so that people can't interact with their stacks going down or their stacks going up. And technically, depending on if all of your allies are together in the turn order, and the turn order constantly shifts based on who's just gone. They go to the bottom of the turn order, so it cycles. But if you get really lucky, you have all of your allies together at the beginning of a combat cycle. Then if you're the last one in that list, which generally won't happen because you'll be building speed preferentially on the Writsmith. But let's just say hypothetically that it does. You have a very fast team. Then you can cast this ability and blank out all of the enemy's turns for that combat cycle without them getting to take them. So it should feel like a rank 10. It should feel like you're doing something that's very strong, very much almost broken in how powerful it is. You're stopping time. You're circumventing the rules of the narrative, more or less. Um, or rather, you're operating outside of its confines, of its bounds. Um, as for our goals with the class and whether we think we reach them, um, I consider this class to be pretty close to reaching what it needed to reach in terms of helping to fulfill the fantasy of the character. I think echo stacks are very interesting. I think they interact in interesting ways. Um, the one thing that I would say that might be difficult for players is if you're coming from a background where you are used to playing a melee and then your first playthrough is the Cavalier and then you play this class, it's going to feel radically different. There's not very much crossover there in terms of skill set. And I do think that very different players are going to want to play the Writsmith versus playing the Cavalier as their first character. We'll try and do our best to indicate what type of player might enjoy either one. Um, but the skills aren't really super interdisciplinary, or gosh, what's the word? I think that is true. That's the word I wanted to use.
Yeah,
But
the things you learn from playing the other class will not, or at least more than likely won't carry over to playing another class.
right, right. And so with this class more than others, if you're expecting that the other class is teaching you how to play this one, you're gonna come in and you're gonna you might feel like an accountant almost with all the echo stacks that you're managing. And hopefully that's fun. We haven't been able to test it on our combat build yet, through no fault of our programming team, or at least our current programming team. But once we do, I think we'll have our answer either way, whether it works or not. And I don't think that this system would work on pen and paper at all, but certainly within the context of a video game, when you have all the information arrayed for you and everything's ticking down on its own, um, it can be very interesting. It can be very cool. Um, the other concern I have is just that Storm as a mechanic in Magic the Gathering. Mark Rosewater, the lead designer for a number of sets, said that the likelihood of them returning to the storm mechanic is very low. And I read into his statement that that's because it's an unbalanced mechanic, and it's hard to do in a way that is balanced. And I think that we run the risk of having a class here that takes a little while to understand at first, but then as the game grows and grows, and as years pass, or however long the player base is still interacting with the game, um, as time goes on, players are going to realize, like, oh, I can do this. And then there will be preferential builds, there will be items that help you to do that thing that is broken better. We might have to
That
learn
that is
other
very
stuff.
inevitable, though.
It is. It's
Does
certainly inevitable.
it doesn't matter for the most part in this situation if we had the storm mechanic on that ability or not.
Right.
There's always going to be someone or a bunch of people who are going to find one little niche thing and just make it so it's the best thing.
Sure. I just
It's yeah.
worry, because the people at Magic the Gathering know what they're doing. Like the Wizards of the Coast teams, their design teams for those cards are just fantastic. And if they're wary of the mechanic, then I think we should be wary of it too. Um,
Oh yeah, definitely.
yeah. But that's the Writsmith.